his farm girl. What happens next is shocking. Also, she's in love with the scarecrow. On the humble little farm, a crippled old lady named Louisa wakes up with a scorned expression. She walks to the kitchen to get coffee, but it ain't there. She begins to angrily call out for someone named Mary Jo. When she doesn't hear a reply, she goes looking. Apparently, Louisa chose violence this morning, because when she finds Mary Jo, she begins to beat her with her cane. Louisa scolds her for oversleeping and failing to fulfill her morning coffee-making duties. Mary Jo gets up and dashes to the kitchen where she collapses for no reason. The old lady tosses her a basket, demanding some eggs. She runs off to do so, and we catch Louisa's husband, George, having a bit of a peek. Inside the chicken coop, Mary Jo gets to harvesting, and the ever-helpful George keeps a watchful eye outside. He's making sure she's doing a swell job. I for one give her an A+, but I think George is more inclined to give her a D. Academically speaking, of course. Suddenly, Mary Jo spots George's gaze, and he's gone in an instant. She heads back inside to hand in the eggs, but George stops her, demanding she milks a cow. She stands there like a deer in headlights. She stares at the keys around his neck and imagines taking off in his car. She snapped out of her daydream as George repeats his demands. Milk the cow. Just as before, Mary Jo does as she's told while good old George supervises. But this time, something's different. He suddenly becomes filled with rage and attacks poor Mary Jo. She retaliates with a milk-based attack. It's highly effective. Mary Jo begins to run away, but George threatens to call the cops. You see, he actually found her not too long ago running away from the scene of a robbery. So she's basically trapped here now. To make things even more dramatic, Louisa comes running out of the house. Mary Jo screams to get her attention, but amidst all the commotion, George bonks her on the head. Louisa closes in, so George cleverly throws hay on Mary Jo. Stealth. He does his best to shoo away Louisa, but she's not so dumb. And his speech abilities are very poor. Skill issue. Once she notices the milk on his shirt, it's game over. She rushes in, and George already begins to apologize. But when they look down, they see the pile of hay, without Mary Jo inside. She's run off. They spot her trail, and as they make their way over, Mary Jo collapses. At least she's got company. The scarecrow. In her state of daze and confusion, she watches as it comes alive. Instead of terror, she feels comfort at the sight of this new friend, then passes out. George arrives on the scene with Louisa on his back. He checks Mary Jo's pulse. She's fine. He warns his wife not to listen to anything she might say, given that she just had a head injury. Suddenly, Mary Jo wakes up and begins asking where her man went. She seems to be madly in love with someone. Could she be referring to the scarecrow? Some time passes and George gets to chatting with Mary Jo again. She tells him that she already has a friend and just wants to hang out with him. Then, Louisa barges in, demanding to know what they're talking about. Mary Jo begins to blabber on about her man. He's tall, always wears a hat and a suit, is big and strong, is secretly made out of straw. Okay, she didn't say the last part. Louisa gets angry, demanding for the table to be set. As Mary Jo walks off, Louisa happily tells her husband that Mary Jo is officially crazy, which means no one else will take her in, which means they'll have a free helper on the farm for life. The prospect of always having Mary Jo around makes George very happy, suspiciously so. Louisa looks on with spite in her eyes. Later, in the middle of the night, George starts spazzing out in bed. You see, he's dreaming about Mary Jo. He erupts from his slumber and hears laughter coming from outside. It's her, all alone, but having a blast nonetheless. Relatable. George peers back at his wife. She's fast asleep. Time to act up. George goes outside and starts looking for Mary Jo, who is now frolicking around through the fields. She stumbles upon her man's, the scarecrow, and begins a very one-sided conversation. He's left speechless by her beauty. In the background, George closes in and watches as Mary Jo talks to this inanimate object. He creeps in, closer, reaching out a hand. Though, once she realizes it's him, she's terrified. The scarecrow is also too shook to move. George explains that the scarecrow isn't a real man, like he is. But she doesn't believe his conspiracy theory and runs away. George is left dumbfounded. By the time he returns home, Luis is already up and waiting for him, wondering where he was. He claims he heard a critter, But then the both of them hear Mary Jo laughing it up, returning home. Louisa laughs it off, realizing Mary Jo probably went to go see her imaginary man. Before returning to bed, she's sure to call George a fool a couple times for good measure. Sometime later, George spots Mary Jo rocking some fresh new drip. Sheesh. She mentions that she's having another date tonight at 12 and hopes her mans will like her new outfit. George assures her he'll love it. Meanwhile, Louisa watches on. She's enraged at the way George looks at Mary Jo. In an act of rage, she spears her pitchfork into the ground. Later that night, Louisa warns George that he better remain faithful to her or else she'll sterilize him like they do with the bulls. But perhaps for Mary Jo, that might just be a risk worth taking. Suddenly, George awakens from his slumber. The clock rings. Midnight is approaching. We cut to Mary Jo, once again frolicking through the fields on her way to Mr. Scarecrow. She lovingly embraces her mans. Then, we slowly zoom into its eyes. They open. The figure slowly uncurls its fingers, then outstretches its arms before wrapping them around Mary Jo. She can hardly contain her excitement. Her mans is truly alive. Meanwhile, Louisa tosses around in bed while feeling out for George. Once she realizes he's gone, she springs up. She heads out in search of the pair as they continue to dance in the night. Her weapon of choice? Pitchfork, of course. And given her lack of mobility, she decides to pull up in the whip. Sweet ride. George hears Louisa coming and goes back into NPC mode. Sadly, Mary Jo is heartbroken and begs the Scarecrow to come back to life. She even hops onto it, but even that won't get him moving again. Louisa arrives on the scene and witnesses Mary Jo's foolishness. She scolds the girl for being so silly and offers to demonstrate that her man is nothing more than rags and straw. She readies her pitchfork and unknowingly plunges it into George. He takes the initial hit like a champ, but then she just keeps going over and over again. See, it's just straw, she says. Uh-oh, maybe it isn't. The Scarecrow collapses and the mask slips off. Louisa looks upon her fallen husband and for the last time calls him a fool. As she mourns over him, Mary Jo looms behind her. She grabs the pitchfork and takes Louisa out. Then she grabs the car keys and dances off while shouting, "I'm finally free!" It seems like this was all a 200 IQ elaborate ruse. Well done. Moral of the story? Milk the cow.